This lesson is create a CRUD web page. The objectives for this lesson are to look at a CRUD web page. I'm going to give you a quick overview of mustache.js, which is what I'm using to build this web page. We're going to talk about how the CRUD page is built, and we'll do a quick code review. The intent of this lesson is to show you how the Fetch API is used in a real application. I'm not going to be giving you any step-by-step in this lesson, but I do have a lab that builds this page, so you can do that on your own. So let's start out by looking at the CRUD web page. Let's start out by taking a look at how the web page looks when it's running. So I've got a people maintenance header. I then have a add person button. I then have a table of people data. So that's coming from that people.json in the web API server. If I click on add a person, I can type in anything I want into here. And then I can save that data. And notice the new person added message right there. If we go down to the bottom, you should see the new value has appeared. If we were to go over to the web API, we would see that new person JSON object has been added to the people.json. We can also click on the edit button. It fills in the form. We can change whatever we want. And then we can save that. Notice the person updated message, and then it goes away. And we see the value here. And if we go over to the web API, we can see people.json has indeed been updated. And when we come back here, we can then delete that new person. It goes away. There was a message up here that said the person was deleted. If we go back to the people.json, we see that it has gone away. So there we go. We've got a full CRUD capability. Let's talk a little bit about how we build this before we start diving into the code. Let's take a look at the HTML. The HTML has up here at the top our H1 people maintenance. We then have a couple of spans wrapped up into a div here. The first one has the ID of message, has a class of info message. That means there's a style that was added. And we've got another one, ID error, class equals error message. Both of them are d-none, which is Bootstrap's way of making these invisible. So they don't show up until we need them. You did see the info message briefly appear there when I added a new person, when I updated a new person. Next, on line 16, I have a div ID equals list, class equals d-none. So I've made this whole area invisible. Inside of there, I've got a row and a column and a button. And the button is for adding that person. Notice the onClick calls peopleController.add. We'll talk about what that is in just a bit. Next, we see the table. So the table has an ID of people. Remember that, because we're going to be using that. You see the T head with all of the headers, but notice the T body is empty. That's where we're going to be filling in the rest of the table that gets drawn. Next, we have a form. So these are just the standard input fields that we've been using throughout this course. And then we have a last form group down here with a couple of buttons. The save button calls peopleController.save, and the cancel button calls peopleController.cancel. So again, we're going to take a look at where this people controller comes from and how this works. Now, to draw that table, what we're going to do is we're going to use Mustache, which is a templating engine. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But look at line 76. We have pound list within the curly braces. And then on line 95, we have slash list within the curly braces. These are tokens, and these tokens say that we're looking for a property called list in whatever the object is that has the data. And then between those two is the code that we want to repeat for each person in our person array. So we're going to build a TR, we're going to build TDs, we're going to substitute person ID, first name, last name, email address into that area. So that builds the TDs for each of those columns in the table. And the buttons also get drawn into that in the first column there. And notice that they're calling peopleController.getEntity, passing in a person ID, or peopleController.deleteEntity, passing in the person ID. The last thing on this page is we have our scripts. So we're referencing Mustache library In the JS folder, we're doing common.js and also people.js, and we'll talk about those, so just hang on. And then on lines 106 through 108, when the window loads, we want to have it call peoplecontroller.get. That's what goes out and gets all of that data that loads up the table. So how did we get that table to be built out of that data coming back from the web API? Well, I wanted to use a JavaScript templating engine instead of just writing JavaScript. That gets a little messy. And there's a few of them out there, by the way. But what a templating engine does is it renders HTML for tokenized HTML that you store in a script tag, or you could even store in a JavaScript literal string if you wanted. The replaceable tokens typically look like this. They have a open curly brace twice, and then the name of the property that has the value that you wish to put into that location in the HTML, followed by two closing curly braces. And what you do is you feed the tokenized HTML and the array of data that you get from your web API service to Mustache. Mustache then renders the HTML by iterating over the array of data. And what it does is it then replaces all the tokens with the data in the property values for those properties. For more information on this, check out this link here to get full instructions on mustache.js. As a simple little example, let's take a look here where I've got a select ID equals people. And what we want to do is we want to fill that up with options. So I've got this script tag where I've set the ID equal to list template. The type, though, is text/HTML. It's not text/JavaScript, which you'd normally find on a script tag. You then see the double curly braces and then a pound list, and then you see a slash list at the end. Well, list is the name of the property that holds our array of data. Then inside of that, I'm putting what I want it to emit each time it iterates over this array. So each time I want an option with the value equal to the person ID, and then within the option and the closing option tag, I want the last name, comma, first name of my person. We make the call to get people data, just like we normally would. We process the response object, and then I'm going to call this method called render HTML. Well, this function takes your response. We create a variable that's a wrapper around this list property. Remember, list was what I had in that script tag. And I say I want the response.data. Well, that's our array of people, isn't it? So then we do let temp equals document.getElementById, grabbing that script tag, but just the inner HTML, so everything between the script and the closing script tag. Then let HTML equal mustache.render, passing in that template and the data. We can then do a document.getElementById on people. Remember, that's the select. And we can set its inner HTML equal to the HTML rendered by Mustache. That then produces a drop-down list. So we're going to see all this in just a bit. Now our CRUD page, if you remember, I had quite a few things in there. The Index.html uses Bootstrap. It uses our own site.css. It uses a common.js, a people.js, and mustache.js. People.js is where we make our web calls through the Fetch API to our web API server to get data. The Index.html page, it has the table for displaying a list of people, a form for displaying a single person, span tags for displaying informational or error messages, so you saw each one of these appear on that page at any different time. The tokenized HTML for the table is in that script tag that we're going to see in just a minute, and it references those 3 JavaScript files just like I said. Inside of the common.js, I have a closure called common. It's going to just simply toggle the HTML areas such as the list or the detail, or it displays those informational messages. It handles status codes such as 400, 404, 500, things like that, and will display an appropriate error message. So the common has things that I could reuse over and over again from page to page, or even from application to application. In the people.js, it contains a closure called peopleController, and it's responsible for calling the web API using fetch. It creates a view model variable that you can see over here that has all these various properties to control how the index.html page works. It can display the table or detail with the mode property. So the mode property would be set to list or edit, for example, or add. It calls Mustache to render the HTML. It has methods such as get entity, insert entity, update entity, and delete entity, as well as build list, that's the one that calls mustache, process response object, and things like that. So let's take a look at the code now in the people.js and the common.js. Common.js contains a single variable called common, and it's a closure. It's put inside of an immediately invoked function expression. And then inside of here, we've got some functions. And the first one is that process response object. Well, this is the same exact code that we did in this class. That's great. I've got one to handle a network error. I've got a function to handle an error if it's the status is a 400 or a 404 or a 500, where it grabs the message or the status information, and then it's going to display that on the console, but it'll also return it, and then we can display it in an error span that we saw in the index page. I've got a little function here to fix up the dates that are coming back from .NET, because .NET sends them back as a full date. I want to just make sure that it's correct for JavaScript to display in a input field that's marked as type date. It has some generic display methods, such as display list. We either have the table showing or we have the form showing, so the list or the detail. You can't have them both, right? You saw that when I ran the application there. So we've got display list, which looks for that list, that's that div, and makes it visible. And then it takes the detail and makes it invisible, all by removing or adding d-none. Same thing for displaying a message, same thing for displaying an error, displaying buttons, displaying the detail only, hiding the buttons. All of these things are just part of this common.js. And then these are all exposed from this closure, this immediately invoked function expression, by doing a return and mapping each of these property names here to the function to call. Do you know why you should subscribe to YouTube channels? You'll get notifications when new videos appear. You'll get recommendations for related channels. It helps the channel grow, which allows me to create more videos for you. It helps attract others to my channel. Your like helps others find videos that are good. So please take the time to like and subscribe to my channel, Paul D. Sheriff. Let's now go open people.js. There is one variable here called people controller. And if you remember, you saw that in that index page. And this is also an immediately invoked function expression. So it's got some private data. But let's go all the way to the bottom, because there's the return that returns each one of those that we saw being called from the index page. Let's start at the top and figure out what this people controller does. Well, first thing I have is a view model. And it has things like list and entity and data and mode and API URL. And that looks familiar, doesn't it? That's the one going over and calling our minimal web API for people to get the data. Has an OK, status text, so all those things that we get back from the response. Has our message, if you remember, we're returning a message in our response. And the last response, that object there, is going to actually be the real fetch API response object. Now, in the list property, it's going to contain that list of people. And the entity would be when we're editing or adding, it contains that single entity that we're adding or editing at that time. I do have one more thing here on line 19, start date formatted, because what we're getting back from .NET is actually just a date in .NET format. We need to make sure that we convert it to a real JavaScript date so that we can convert it to our locale date string. Now, I'm in the US, so I'm going to go ahead and just use my US formatted date. Let's go down and take a look at the get function now. What this one does is it uses the fetch API URL. So it goes out and gets that list of people data. And then, just like we saw before, the first then does the process response object. Well, let's take a look at this. So I'm going to jump down to this, because this one actually is an asynchronous function, because it's going to call over to the common.processResponse object. Remember the one we've used in this course. And it's going to pass in the fetch API response, and we're going to get back our response object. And that's the one coming from .NET. So then we can fill in the viewModels.OK property with response.OK, the viewModel status with the response status, the status text, the message, the data, and the last response, which is this actual fetch API response object. and then it returns the view model. Let's go back up to the top. So when we get that response back, it now passes that to the data property in that second then. We then check to see if the view model is .ok. If it is, great, we know we got data. So now we can take the data.data, because remember, we're passing the list of people objects in the data property, and we're going to take that and assign it to viewModel.list. Why to viewModel.list? Well, if we go back over to Index.cshtml, because on line 76, this template is looking for a list property. So those must match. Then we call build list. Build list, this is what Mustache uses. It's very similar to what you saw in the slides there, where I go out and I say let template equal to document.getElementById list template. That was that script tag. And I grab its text. I then let HTML equal to mustache.render. Pass it the template and the view model, because remember the view model is where that list is. Then it does all of its rendering and returns that fully populated HTML back to me. I now, in line 199, do document.getElementById people, that's the table, get elements by tag name, tbody, go after the first element within there and change its inner HTML equal to that HTML that got rendered by Mustache. And then I call that common.displayList, which turns on the area for the table and turns off the area for the form. Let's go back up to the top here. So we had the get. There's also the get entity. So we pass in an ID that actually comes from the table. Remember, get entity was called right here when we clicked on the edit button. It did peopleController.getEntity, passing in that person ID. So that gets passed into the getEntity method here. We set the viewModel.mode to edit because we're going into edit mode. Look at line 57, our fetch. Looks very familiar, right? We call our API URL and we pass in the ID. We then process the response object. It passes that to the second then, and inside of here we check to make sure everything is okay. And we then put the data into the entity property. We set the input, which actually, we take a look at this one real quick. This one fixes up the start date to make sure it's in a valid JavaScript format of what's coming from .NET. And then we just take the values out of the entity and put it into those input fields. We then go back up. We then display the buttons. We unhide the save and the cancel. We unhide the detail area. Now, let's say we didn't find the ID for some reason. Well, then we would do a display of an error. Or maybe we got a network error, so we'd handle those as well. So I've got all of that built in here. But you can see this is very similar to what we did in all the rest of this course. We're now just wrapping it all up into a working application. So the function insert entity, we build a request object. I called it options here. Method : post, body, JSON.stringify, viewModel.entity, the headers, and then we pass that to the fetch, and everything works, right? We just get everything. It's just the update, the delete, everything is what we've already seen. There's just a little bit more functionality to turn things off and on as necessary for this web page. So in this lesson, we saw a CRUD page. We learned a little bit about mustache.js. We saw how fetch is used in a real application, and we inserted, updated, and deleted people through this web page. In this course, we learned that the fetch API is better than the XML HTTP request. It's promise-based and object-oriented. That makes it real easy to get data and very easy to modify data. So definitely take advantage of this API. So where might you go from here? Well, maybe learn more about what the fetch API can do. Learn more about MVC. Maybe learn more about the minimal web API. And by the way, I have a course on my channel to actually learn the minimal web API. And I also have another course, Fetch API using Node.js. So again, please subscribe to my channel. That way you'll get any notifications when I add new material, which I'm doing all the time.